Hi, you clicked onto today's tropical tidbit for Friday over here in the Atlantic. We've got Tropical Storm Richard in the Western Caribbean, and in the Eastern Atlantic we got a lot of low pressure. We got something over here east of the Cape Verde Islands labeled orange by the NHC. Not likely to do a whole lot over here, but you can see the upward motion west of Africa over here, sinking motion in between, and a little bit of upward motion here where Richard is. Still some large-scale sinking in this area, but reversing slowly as the pattern shifts back towards upward motion in this area, because sinking air has now returned to the Pacific, and we're going to really start focusing some upward motion in this area over the next 10 to 15 days. If we zoom in on Richard over here, we see on first glance looks like a much more organized storm than yesterday. It looks very nice, and notice the winds whipping around over here. The inflow is very nice and healthy looking. One of the most ironic things I've seen this season is the recon going in there and finding a central pressure of 1010 millibars, and the buoy between Jamaica and Honduras here confirms that. Rather odd to see a satellite presentation like this with a pressure 3 millibars higher than it was yesterday. You can see on the buoy over here, notice how the pressure was going down, down, down yesterday, had a nice spike in here, then it sort of leveled off and has risen gradually on average since yesterday, but notice how the winds have gone up now a lot this morning, and this is interesting to see. And again, you see the inflow is very healthy over here. You got a lot of winds coming around. This recon found stronger surface winds on average around the circulation. So really this is a more organized storm. What this is probably indicating to us is that the circulation has tightened up, is a lot less broad than yesterday. Remember, yesterday we had multiple vortices and a rather broad center of circulation over here. We've now got a tighter deal and a convective ball that has moved over the center and tried to feed back. Haven't gotten the lowering pressures yet. We probably will eventually. And notice the overall movement of this thing. If we take the circulation as a whole, the movement is west or just north of west. If we look at the whole darn thing, the recon found a surface center diving this way on the plane data, trying to dive out of the south of the convective mass. I have a feeling this is a weakening surface center, probably leaving the mid-level center behind, which is still tucked up here underneath the convection and probably very healthy. Moving off to the west over here, we'll probably get a new surface center to form under this today as this comes west, and we'll start to see some gradual intensification. But you can see how this is better organized, and this is not dissipating like the models thought it was going to a couple of days ago. If we look at the water vapor imagery over here, here's Richard. Here's the streaming flow out. The trough is like this. We're still getting a lot of sinking air in front of the storm, so lots of dry air here pressing into the northwest quad, but not as bad as yesterday because you got the center now under the convection, so the shear is not as bad and the dry air is not pressing into the circulation quite as much, but this is still a hindering factor. Notice the trough now starting to come out of the Four Corners regions and come up this way. This is going to be something that changes the steering flow as this ridge is going to come across and build off the southeast United States coastline, force this west and then north with time. If we look at the European 48 hours over here, day 2, here's our trough over here, here's our ridge building over to the top, and you can see low pressure down in the Caribbean where the ensembles think the storm is, and notice our big trough sitting in the Gulf of Alaska ready to come in phase as this short wave butts up against the ridge. We go to day 3, here's our short wave starting to flatten out. Look at the monster ridge over here pressing against this, so this short wave is not going to be able to dig in, but here comes our trough out of Alaska, and here's where the storm is on the model. We go out to day 4, shortwave kind of weakens, big pumping ridge east of the Uniday States, and here's that trough starting to dig in. Here's where the ensembles think the storm is. We've now got air getting pulled out of the Caribbean this way, so we're going to have an environment fairly favorable for strengthening as this comes towards the Yucatan with less dry air in here, because instead of sinking air in front of the storm you have rising air, and this will get rid of some of that dry air a little bit. And the steering flow, you can see the ridge in here, and here's the steering flow on out into the trough over here. If we go out to day 5, here's where the storm is on the model, big trough in here, ridge off the eastern seaboard. Seems pretty straightforward. Not all the models agree. Here's the rest of them over here, and you see the NHC track is farther west. We see a lot of the models farther west now. We had them shifting northeast, and now we have them shifting west over here. A lot of them going back to the dying over Central America solution, or getting out into the western Gulf of Mexico and dying to sinking air, dry air, and high pressure over here. And notice how the GFS ensembles, which were all in this camp yesterday, have now shifted and are now up like this. And I like this general idea. I still like my track over the northeast Yucatan and then up into the Gulf of Mexico over here. And I'm not going to point out a landfall because you really could get a window like this depending on how the trough ridge orientation goes over here. Generally, Florida, I still think at the most risk of getting the landfall, though I could see anyone in the eastern Gulf of Mexico getting the hit. So everyone in this area should be watching and see how the models point in the general direction of the eastern half of the Gulf. And these over here, still, I'm skeptical about these. I really am. I still like my track up over the eastern Yucatan. And remember, if this does come over the Yucatan, it'll be strengthening and be probably a potent storm coming in, because I think that despite the pressures not being lowered yet, the structure of this means that as the dryer gets out of the way and we're going to get more ridging over the top of this, we're going to have a fairly potent storm coming in towards the Yucatan, and folks in here are going to have to watch this system. And if we get a track all the way up to the North Gulf Coast in here, we'll likely end up with a fairly weak storm by the time it gets there. Waters are approaching 26 Celsius or lower in the northern Gulf coastal waters, and although wind shear, as I showed you yesterday, will be low in this region relative to normal as ridging builds over the top, the cold water and dry air in this area will probably weaken such a storm if it comes to the North Gulf Coast. If we somehow get a swing all the way to the Florida Peninsula like the hurricane models were showing yesterday, which you notice they are not anymore, if we were to get a swing like this, we'd have more potential for a stronger storm. But basically either interaction with the Yucatan or a track farther north like this is likely to end up in not so big of a deal for the United States, but they still need to keep an eye on this in case this tries to ramp up, stay over water. Notice how the track through the channel is not as likely anymore. Still got to keep an eye open for that door, but as my track has been, yesterday my track was still over land, it still is today as well, and would likely result in a weaker system coming into the Gulf, which is good news for the United States, but Mexico is going to have to watch this closely. And this all works very nicely with the idea of the teleconnection of the typhoon in the western Pacific. Maggie still hanging out here recurving, and the typhoon recurving slowly works well with my idea that this comes in and then gets drawn north. And notice how the typhoon is weakening in here, also works well with the idea that if it comes towards the North Gulf Coast, it will be a weakening storm. So we'll see if these things come together and work. If we go out ahead in time now, as the GFS day 10, notice the lowering of pressures and upward motion in the eastern Caribbean, central Atlantic. Notice the tucking and turning of winds in here. We go out to day 15. Look what we have near Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, lowering pressures and a storm trying to develop in the eastern Caribbean shown by the GFS, and you can see a general lowering of pressures throughout this whole area. Does this make sense? Gotta ask yourself this on the long-range model forecast. Does it make sense? I'm not going to tell you that this is likely just because the GFS says so. That's not going to happen. If we look at the water temps, notice all the warm water left behind over here, and notice how the waters in here have cooled. Remember how much warmer these waters were in here just 2-3 weeks ago, and these have been cooled. Remember, as the Cape Verde season shut down in here, we had the cold water from all the Cape Verde hurricanes that came across. You can still see some of it left over. Waters in here are still warm, but this got shut down. We focused the action into here, and we got a lot of storms in this area that tried to cool the water, and we ended up with lowering of pressures in here, and pressures were building over Mexico. You got a gradient with northerly winds coming down. If we look at this for the last 30 days, here's the lowering pressures, here's the high pressure. You had northerly winds coming down with cooler air and more evaporative properties, evaporating the surface of the ocean, cooling water temps, so you relieved some of the heat in this area of the world. What's left behind is the rest of the warm water down here in the eastern Caribbean and central Atlantic, so it makes sense that after the burst of storms we have had in this region that we temporarily focus back to the east and watch for upward motion to focus over here and lower pressures. And now that you've got the cool water in here, you're drawing down troughs over the eastern seaboard more, and that's drawing air out of this area, which ventilates the eastern Caribbean and central Atlantic. So this all makes sense for some mischief to perhaps shift over here as upward motion comes over into this area of the world. So we will need to watching for Sherry down the road next week and the week after to see if we can get some more fun and games in the Caribbean. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.